They said she could heal anything as long as it had a pulse. If it breathed, she could save it. If it begged, she could silence its pain. But what they didn't know was that she could also decide who deserved to breathe at all. Sergipe, 1875. In a small sugar plantation near São Cristóvão, they called her Nalia. She wasn't born free, but she was born dangerous. Because while others were taught to lower their heads, she was taught to watch. And she watched everything. The way a man's cough deepened after drinking, the way a bruise faded with the right leaves, the way a master's fear showed only when the lights went out. Nalia had learned medicine from both sides of the world. From her mother, an enslaved woman brought from the coast of Dahomey, she inherited the secrets of roots and spirits, of talking plants and silent poisons. From the priests and doctors who came through the plantation, she learned how white men like to call those same roots science. She listened, she mixed, she remembered, and in the heart of the cane fields, while others were bleeding their lives into the soil, Nalia was feeding something else, a quiet, invisible rebellion. They said she could cure the overseer's fever faster than any priest's prayer. They said she once brought a dying child back from the edge with only her hands. They said her touch could pull pain out of the body like a thorn from skin. But one day, someone else started watching her. Major Beno Foucault, the new owner of the estate, a man whose wealth had been built on the bodies of others. He believed kindness was weakness and mercy was disease. When he arrived, the air changed. The plantation that had once murmured with quiet endurance became a cage of iron silence. He cut rations. He punished anyone who spoke out of turn. And he took Nalia's herbs, forcing her to heal the very men who broke her people's backs. He called her my little doctor. She called him nothing. Every night, she'd wash her hands until the skin cracked, trying to remove the smell of blood mixed with sugar. And every morning, she'd smile, because she had already chosen her medicine. It wasn't a leaf. It wasn't a prayer. It was time. She began collecting tiny doses of the deadliest things nature offered, roots that killed slowly like guilt, berries that silenced the heart as softly as forgiveness. And she mixed them with care not to destroy, but to balance, to measure justice, drop by drop. People in the Senzala whispered that Nalia had changed. Her songs were softer, her eyes distant. At night, she spoke to the moon like she was making a promise. And, in a way, she was, because she had decided that if freedom could not be born in daylight, then it would rise at the table, hidden in a cup of wine. The plan began when she was called to heal the major's wife, Dona Filomena, a cruel woman wrapped in lace and loneliness. Her sickness wasn't the body, it was a power. But Nalia treated her as she treated all things that decayed slowly, with patience, with observation, with quiet calculation. When Filomena began to recover, the house rejoiced. There would be a feast, she said, a night to thank the saints and honor the woman who had saved her. And so, under candlelight and song, Nalia prepared the drinks herself, each glass measured, each bottle sealed, each smile rehearsed. She had spent years turning pain into medicine. Now she would turn medicine into truth. That night, as the guests raised their glasses to the sound of violins, a wind moved through the sugar fields. Cold and sharp, the moon watched as if it already knew the ending. Nalia lifted her eyes once, not to heaven, but to the faces of those who believed themselves untouchable. And when the first toast echoed through the hall, she whispered, barely moving her lips, "For every life you took, may this one return." Then she smiled and served the wine. It began with laughter, the kind of laughter that only the powerful know. Thick with wine, careless with cruelty, candles trembled as the men told stories of their youth, boasting of the slaves they had broken, the fortunes they had stolen, and the laws they had bent to make themselves gods. Outside, the night insects sang louder, as if trying to drown the music inside. The sugar field swayed like black waves on the moon. And in the kitchen, Nalia waited, her hand steady, her heart like a drum beneath her ribs. Every sound came to her clearly, the clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair, the cough that came too soon after the first toast. She didn't move. She simply listened. The Major's voice rose above the others, boasting that no sickness could touch him. Not fever, not poison, not fate. He said it loud enough for the servants to hear, because he liked to remind them that even God had to kneel before his gold. But God wasn't the one listening that night. It was Nalia and the ancestors she carried in her bones. By the time the second bottle was opened, the air in the dining room had thickened. Philomena's smile froze on her face. Her husband's laughter broke in half. And one by one, the men who had built their lives on others' pain began to feel the earth tilt beneath their feet. The room fell silent. A chair collapsed. A man's hand clutched at his chest. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, though the sky was still clear. Nalia stepped into the doorway. The candlelight painted her face in gold and shadow. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise. She simply asked, "Shall I bring the remedy?" The Major's mouth opened, but no words came. He pointed at her, the gesture of a man who had commanded his whole life, and suddenly realized command meant nothing. She walked toward him slowly, the sound of her bare feet against the floor. A heartbeat that wasn't his anymore. Philomena screamed. The servants froze, torn between fear and awe, and Nalia, calm as the river after a storm, knelt beside the man who had called her my little doctor. She took his hand, the same hand that had signed whippings, that had written receipts for flesh and bone. "Your pulse is weak," she whispered, "but it remembers." He tried to speak, to curse, to beg, but his body was already confessing what his mouth could not. The poison was slow, made from a root that didn't kill instantly, but made the heart fight itself first. It was the same root used in old Dahomey rituals, to judge those who had betrayed the village. A poison not of death, but of truth. For hours, the plantation held its breath. The music stopped. The guests were carried out, their faces pale, their bodies trembling between this world and the next. In the morning, only the birds dared to sing. By then, 3 men were dead, 2 were dying, and Major Foucault, the man who believed himself immortal, lay silent, his hand still clutching the tablecloth as if trying to hold the world in place. When the soldiers came days later, they found Nalia waiting. She did not run. She did not weep. She was grinding herbs, as she always had, the smell of mint and earth filling the air. "What did you do?" they demanded. She looked at them, her eyes calm and ancient. "I healed," she said. "I just didn't say who." They called it murder. She called it balance. The trial was swift. The witnesses spoke in whispers. No one dared meet her gaze. Even the priest who came to hear her confession left trembling. When asked if she repented, she smiled faintly. "I repented," she said, "the first time I healed a man who whipped a child." The judges sentenced her to die by hanging. But the night before her execution, the prison guards swore the air smelled of burnt sugar and rain. By morning, her cell was empty. Only her clothes remained, folded neatly beside a bowl of crushed leaves. Some said she turned into smoke. Others said her people broke her free. But those who had known her best said something different. They said the land itself took her back. For weeks, nothing would grow near the plantation house. Then, suddenly, herbs began to sprout where the blood had fallen, the same herbs she used to heal and to harm. The locals still avoid that place after dark, but sometimes, when the wind moves through the fields, it carries a whisper, a woman's voice, soft but unyielding. Freedom tastes bitter before it heals. And somewhere beyond the reach of masters and laws, Maiden Nalia walks among her roots, turning poison into memory. And memory, the trial was held in the church courtyard of Sao Cristovo, under the watch of the same cross that had once blessed slave ships. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, not even the judges who hid their trembling behind Latin words. Maiden Nalia stood barefoot before them, dressed in white linen that had belonged to someone else. Her wrists were bound, but her eyes were free. The people came from miles away to see her, some out of fear, some out of faith, and a few quietly out of gratitude. They whispered that she had done what God himself refused to do, that she had made the scales of the world even, if only for a night. But to the men who ruled the province, she was a danger greater than rebellion, because rebellion they could crush. Faith they could not. The prosecutor was a priest named Father Aranya, a man known for his sermons about purity and punishment. He had once healed the major's son with a prayer, and believed that women like Nalia were demons in disguise. He spoke of her as if she were a disease. She carries the devil's tongue, he said. Her hands are altars of deceit. She turned the Lord's mercy into vengeance. Nalia listened, silent. When her turn came, she didn't defend herself. She simply asked a question. Father, she said, when Christ touched the leper, was he healing or disobeying? The words rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Even the guards shifted their feet. The priest faltered. His mouth opened, but no scripture came. She continued, her voice low and steady. You call me a witch because I know what grows in the dark. But who built that darkness, Father? Who planted it? The judges struck their gavels, shouting for silence. The priest turned red with rage, spitting words about sin and punishment. But the people had already seen something that couldn't be unseen. A woman who stood before power and didn't kneel. The next witness was an old midwife from the plantation, a woman who had once buried 3 of her own children. Her hands shook as she took the stand. She spoke softly, eyes lowered. I saw her give medicine to the sick, she said. I saw her heal wounds that white doctors wouldn't touch. And when those men drank her wine, I saw her look at them the way a mother looks at a fever, not with hate, but with decision. Gasps rippled through the court. Even the soldiers outside leaned closer to hear. Father Aranya slammed his hand against the Bible. Decision, he roared. To kill is a sin. To judge is God alone. The midwife turned her eyes toward him, and for the first time, she smiled. Then, perhaps, she said, God borrowed her hands. That night, the priest couldn't sleep. He heard her voice in his prayers, saw her face in the flicker of the candles. He began to wonder if the devil he feared wasn't the woman on trial, but the silence that followed his own sermons. The next morning, rain fell over the courthouse. The judges, eager to cleanse the land of its shame, pronounced the sentence quickly, death by hanging at dawn. But something in the air shifted. The townspeople began leaving offerings at the prison gate. Small bowls of herbs, drops of honey, tiny pieces of paper with the names of their sick. By midnight, the priest himself went to her cell. He said he came to deliver confession, but the truth was heavier. He came to ask for a miracle. His sister, bedridden for months, had been given no hope by the doctors. And now, in the dark of the prison, he begged the woman he had condemned. Save her, he whispered. Please, I don't care how. Nalia looked at him for a long time. Then she asked, Do you believe I can? He nodded. Then you already know what faith feels like, she said. And faith is not given, Father. It's remembered. She reached through the bars, placing her hand over his trembling one. Her fingers were warm. Go home, she said softly. Burn rosemary in her room. Leave the window open. And when you pray, don't ask God to forgive you. Ask him to listen. He left before dawn, shaken and wordless. And when he reached home, his sister, pale and weak the day before, was sitting upright, smiling faintly. The fever broke, she whispered. It broke like a chain. From that night on, Father Aranya never mentioned demons again, but he also never spoke of Maid Nalia's trial. When the guards entered her cell the next morning, they found her gone. No footprints, no broken locks, only the faint scent of burnt herbs, and a single phrase scratched into the wall. Poison is only poison until you choose what to heal. And from that day forward, every time a healer was born in Sergipe, they were called Daughters of Nalia, because some medicines once created never truly die. After the night she vanished, the land itself began to remember her. Rain fell in strange patterns, only over the fields where people had once bled. New plants appeared in places where the soil had been dead for decades, and in the villages near Sao Cristovo, women began to dream of her. They said she came barefoot through the sugar cane, her white dress wet with dew, her hands glowing faintly like embers. In the dreams, she never spoke. She only laid her palms on the dreamer's chest, and the pain, whatever it was, would lift like smoke. At first, it was dismissed as folklore, the kind of story the poor tell themselves to survive. But the dreams kept spreading, from farms to fishing towns, from free women to those still bound by invisible chains. And soon, the name Nalia was no longer whispered with fear, but with reverence. The old healers in the countryside began teaching her methods, how to grind herbs without bruising their spirit, how to read illness not as punishment, but as imbalance, how to see in the smallest root the memory of freedom. They called themselves the daughters of Nalia, women who carried medicine in their blood and defiance in their silence. They didn't wear crosses or charms. Their faith was the body itself, its memory, its rhythm, its endurance. They were the midwives who refused to let enslaved children die unnamed. They were the women who healed both the wounds and the rage of men. They were the invisible surgeons of freedom. The authorities noticed. One by one, they began arresting women accused of witchcraft, of mixing African and Christian poisons, of healing without permission. But every time one was taken, another rose in her place. It was as if Nalia's spirit had been divided among them, multiplied like seeds. In the coastal town of Laranjeiras, a girl named Jassera became known for curing the fevers that white doctors couldn't. She said she learned by listening to the sound of boiling water, that it whispered the same rhythm as Nalia's heartbeat. In Itaparanga, an old woman named Sebastiana could look at the veins of a leaf and tell if a storm was coming or if someone in the village was close to dying. When people asked how she knew, she would answer simply, "The plants speak. You just forgot how to listen." Even the freedmen who worked for wages now would secretly visit these women when they were sick, trusting them more than the pale doctors who came with silver instruments and holy arrogance. And while the province tried to erase Nalia's memory from official records, her legend began slipping into songs. Work chants carried her name. Lullabies told children that healing was not obedience. It was rebellion made gentle. One of those songs, recorded decades later by an ethnographer, went something like this. She touched the earth, and it remembered. She whispered the names of the lost. Her fire was quiet as dawn, but it burned the chains to dust. In every verse, the word poison changed meaning, no longer a symbol of death, but of transformation, the bitterness that forces truth to rise. By the late 19th century, when abolitionist movements spread across Brazil, many of their secret gatherings began with a ritual, a circle of herbs burned in silence, a few drops of water poured on the ground, and a single phrase murmured in Yoruba, translated loosely as, "We heal the wound, not the chain." The men thought it was just a blessing, but the women knew it was a warning, because for them, freedom was never only a law, it was a medicine, and like all medicine, it came with a cost. Years later, when abolition finally arrived, the newspapers called it a triumph of civilization. But in Sergipe, the old women simply smiled and said, civilization arrived late. Nalia's wind had already passed. That wind, the one that once carried the scent of poison and mint, still blew through the sugar fields, rustling the leaves like pages of a book that refused to close. And if you stood there long enough, you could almost hear her voice again, not as a ghost, but as memory itself, alive, sharp, It was the year 1903, and Brazil had changed its flag, but not its heart. Freedom was now a word printed on coins, not written in flesh. The chains were gone from wrists, but heavier ones had wrapped themselves around the soul. Poverty, silence, shame. In a small town on the outskirts of Aracaju, a girl named Lucia worked in a pharmacy that smelled of spirits and camphor. She was 17, with eyes that burned too brightly for her time. Every morning, She scrubbed the counters, measured powders, and listened to the pharmacists talk about progress, how science had finally tamed superstition. But at night, when the lamps went out and the cicadas sang, she opened a small wooden box, hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, its edges brown with age, its letters written in two languages, Portuguese and something older. It had been passed down from her grandmother, and before that, from her grandmother's mother. At the top, written in trembling ink, were the words, "May Nalia's remedy of remembrance." The recipe was incomplete. Some ingredients had been smudged by time, but one line remained clear, a plant that no one in the village had seen for years. Cepa de Fogo, the fire vine. They said it grew only once a century, in the exact spot where blood had once fed the earth. And they said whoever found it would have the power to heal anything, even history itself. Lucia couldn't explain why, but she felt the pull of it deep in her chest, as if the roots were already calling her by name. By day, she watched the doctors mock the old healers, calling them witches and ignorant relics. By night, she walked the outskirts of town, following the old paths her grandmother had described in whispers. One evening, she met an old woman sitting by the roadside, chewing on sugarcane and humming a tune. Her hair was white as salt, her eyes sharp as dawn. "You're looking for the wrong thing," the woman said, before Lucia could even speak. "What do you mean?" "The plant you seek isn't in the ground. It's in the truth you're afraid to say out loud." Lucia frowned. "I'm not afraid." The woman smiled. "Then why do you whisper when you say her name?" Lucia's breath caught. "Whose name?" "Magnalia." The air between them changed. The cricket stopped. The wind grew still. "How do you know?" The woman stood, her back straight despite her years. "Because I was her last student," she said. "I saw her vanish, and I swore her medicine would not vanish with her." Lucia's voice trembled. "Then the recipe, it's real?" "Real?" The woman laughed softly. "Child, everything that frightens men is real. That's why they bury it." She handed Lucia a single leaf, glowing faintly red in the moonlight. "Burn this when you're ready," she said. "It will show you where to go." By the time Lucia looked up again, the woman was gone. Only the smell of mint and smoke remained. That night, Lucia burned the leaf. The flame turned blue, then green, then white, and when she closed her eyes, she saw flashes, not her own life, but of Nalia's, the feast, the trial, the prison, the field blooming again. When she woke, her hands were stained red with earth, and on the floor before her, tiny roots had begun to sprout, glowing faintly like veins of light. She gathered them carefully, tears on her face. She knew what it meant. The fire vine had returned, but word spread fast. A local doctor, Dr. Furtado, a man desperate for recognition in the capital, heard of her discovery. He arrived at her door, offering money, protection, and eventually threats. "What you found belongs to science," he said, "to the nation." Lucia stood firm. "It belongs to the women who bled for it." He sneered. "Then it belongs to ghosts." That night, her house was raided. The roots were seized, the parchment burned, and Lucia disappeared. But 3 days later, Dr. Furtado fell ill. His skin turned pale as wax, his breath slow and labored. The doctor could find no cause. Before he died, he whispered a name the nurses didn't recognize. Nalia. When they buried him, flowers sprouted overnight on his grave, a species no one had ever seen before. Small, red, and faintly glowing. The fire vine. It crept along the ground, curling toward the horizon, as if seeking the hands that had once planted it. And far away, in the hills beyond the sugar fields, villagers swore they saw a young woman walking barefoot at dawn, carrying a bundle of herbs, singing an old song. They said her voice was calm and strong, and that the earth trembled softly beneath her feet. And though she called herself Lucia, the people had another name for her, the second healer. Because sometimes a story doesn't end when it's buried. Sometimes it takes root. More than a century has passed since the night made Nalia vanished. But some fires do not fade. They travel, quiet, unseen beneath the ground, until one day they rise again in another form, another woman, another time. In the year 2024, a university in Sergipe opened a small medical archive long forgotten. Inside, among dusty surgical journals and missionary letters, they found a thin notebook wrapped in cloth. It smelled faintly of mint and smoke. The handwriting was delicate, looping, a mix of Portuguese, Yoruba, and Latin. It contained notes on anatomy, childbirth, fever, and a list of plants that no Western pharmacology had ever recorded. At the bottom of one page, in faded ink, was written, "Poison is only the beginning. Healing is the revolution." Signed, Nalia. The professor who found it, a woman named Dr. Helena Foucault, froze when she saw the surname. Her ancestors had once owned the plantation where Nalia lived. And now, generations later, the bloodline of the oppressor was holding the words of the enslaved healer who had defied them. Helena spent months decoding the notebook. She discovered that many of Nalia's remedies contained compounds similar to modern antibiotics, but balanced with herbs that reduce toxicity. Science called it coincidence. Helena called it justice arriving in its own language. She presented the findings in a conference in Salvador. The audience expected numbers and graphs. Instead, she told a story. She spoke of a woman who had healed both fever and fear, who had turned the bitterness of roots into freedom, who had looked at pain not as punishment, but as truth waiting to be remembered. When Helena finished, the hall was silent. Then an old midwife from the back stood and whispered, "My grandmother taught me that recipe." One by one, other voices joined. A teacher, a nurse, a herbalist. Each carried a fragment, a word, a tune, a gesture, descended through mothers who never signed their names. The chain that had once bound them had become a thread connecting them. Outside the building, rain began to fall, and as it hit the streets, the smell of wet earth rose, that same mixture of sugar and storm that once filled the night of the feast. Helena closed her notebook and said softly, "She didn't die, she changed form." Because that's what healers do. They do not vanish. They transform molecule by molecule, story by story. Every nurse who refuses to give up on a dying patient, every woman who studies medicine against all odds, every community doctor who listens before prescribing, they all carry her, not in blood, but in pulse. May Nalia's fire now burns in laboratories, in prayer circles, in protest chants whispered between women cleaning hospital floors at midnight. It burns in the moment someone says no to a system that still decides who deserves to heal and who deserves to suffer. And sometimes, if you walk through Sergipe's old plantations at dusk, you can still feel it, that same trembling in the air, the scent of mint and rain, the faint glow on the horizon where the cane once grew. The locals say it's just lightning, but those who know, those who remember, call it by its true name, Nalia's light, a reminder that knowledge cannot be chained, that every poison holds a lesson, and that the hands which once fed death can teach the world how to live again. Because freedom, like medicine, is never given. It is prepared, measured, and shared. And once it enters the blood of a people, it never leaves. The fire that healed her world still burns in ours, and it will not die until every